In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a deadly fire consumes Amos Finch's tailor shop, and with it, his life. Was it an accident or murder? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle cunning, unravels a web of secrets. An ambitious apprentice, a bitter wife, a prideful client, and a desperate landlord, each with a motive to burn. As whispers of arson spread, one clue a singed receipt points to a shocking truth. In just 30 seconds, step into a mystery where greed sparks tragedy, and only Miss Marple can stitch the clues together to reveal a killer. Chapter 1. The smoldering ruin. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of its thatched cottages and the spire of St. Mary's Church. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her window with a cup of Earl Grey, was contemplating the first primroses in her garden when the distant wail of a fire engine pierced the quiet. Her thin hands paused, the delicate porcelain cup halfway to her lips. The sound was unusual for the village, where life unfolded with the predictability of a well-wound clock. She set the cup down and leaned forward, her sharp blue eyes scanning the horizon. A faint plume of smoke curled above the rooftops, dark and ominous against the pale sky. "Lily," she called, her voice gentle but firm. Her young maid, Lily Price, appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "What's all this commotion? It sounds like trouble." Lily, eager for news, bobbed her head. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. The tailor's shop on High Street's gone up in flames. They say Mr. Finch, poor Mr. Amos Finch, was inside. Dead, they reckon, before the firemen could get to him." Her eyes widened, relishing the drama. "The whole place is nothing but cinders now." Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint crease forming on her brow. Amos Finch, the tailor, was a meticulous man, known for his precise stitches and quiet demeanor. His shop, a narrow establishment wedged between the bakery and the post office, had been a fixture of the village for decades. She recalled his stooped figure, always measuring or pinning, his spectacles slipping down his nose. A fire and a death. Such events were rare in St. Mary Mead, and rarely accidental. "Arson, do they think?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. Lily nodded vigorously. "That's what Mr. Stokes from the fire brigade said to Mrs. Bantry's cook. They found something odd, smelled like petrol," he said. "The police are there now, poking about. Inspector Craddock's come down from Much Benham." Miss Marple's fingers resumed their delicate dance with her knitting, a half-finished scarf draped across her lap. Her mind, however, was far from the soft wool. A fire, deliberately set, suggested motives as tangled as a skein of yarn. Greed, revenge, desperation, human nature, she knew, could kindle such flames as surely as any match. "Poor Mr. Finch," she murmured, more to herself than to Lily. "I suppose they'll be looking for suspects." "Oh yes, Miss Lily," said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Mrs. Bantry's already talking. Says it could be that apprentice of his, Tom Reed, who's always mooning about starting his own shop. Or maybe Mrs. Finch. Everyone knows she and Mr. Finch didn't get on. Then there's that fancy client, Mr. Vance, who was rowing with him over a bill. And Mr. Crosby, the landlord, he's been in a state about money, hasn't he?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Village gossip, like a spider's web, caught every stray thread of truth and rumor. Lily's chatter was a starting point, nothing more, but it was enough to set her thoughts in motion. "Thank you, Lily," she said, dismissing the girl with a nod. "I think I'll take a walk later. The air might do me good." By noon, the village buzzed with speculation. Miss Marple, in her sensible tweed coat and sturdy shoes, strolled toward High Street, her pace unhurried but purposeful. The smell of charred wood grew stronger as she approached the tailor's shop, now a skeletal ruin cordoned off by police tape. A small crowd lingered Mrs. Price from the bakery, Mr. Hodges the postmaster, and a gaggle of curious children. The shop's sign, Finch and Son, Tailors, hung askew, blackened but legible. Miss Marple paused, her gaze sweeping the scene: shattered windows, sodden beams, and a pile of ruined fabric spilling onto the pavement like a funeral shroud. Inspector Craddock, a tall man with a weary expression, stood near the wreckage, conferring with a fireman. He spotted Miss Marple and tipped his hat, a gesture of respect tinged with amusement. "Miss Marple," he greeted, crossing to her. "I might have known you'd be here. Come to offer your insights." She smiled, her expression as soft as her voice. "Oh, Inspector, I'm only an old woman taking her morning constitutional. But it's a sad business, isn't it? Poor Mr. Finch. Have you any idea what happened?" Craddock's face tightened. "Arson, no question. The fire started in the back room, where he kept his stock. Petrol, likely, though we're waiting on tests. Finch was found near his workbench, didn't stand a chance." He hesitated, then added, "We're looking at everyone close to him. Motives aren't hard to find." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the crowd. "People do talk, Inspector. And in a village like this, they see more than they realize." She adjusted her scarf, her mind already threading together the names Lily had mentioned. Tom Reed, with his ambitions. Eliza Finch, with her grievances. Harold Vance, with his pride. Gerald Crosby, with his debts. Each a stitch in a pattern she could not yet discern. As she turned back toward her cottage, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity, sharp and insistent. The smoldering ruin was more than a tragedy, it was a riddle. And Jane Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring instinct for the flaws in human nature, was determined to unravel it. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the landlord. Gerald Crosby's financial troubles were no secret in St. Mary Mead, where debts and mortgages were discussed as freely as the weather. A heavily insured property, reduced to ashes, could be a tempting solution for a man in his position. Yet she cautioned herself against haste. Assumptions, like poorly cut fabric, could ruin the entire design. The conversation turned to village matters, the upcoming fete, the vicar's new sermon, but Miss Marple's mind remained on the fire. She pictured Amos Finch's shop as it had been. The neat rows of thread spools, the measuring tape draped over a chair, the soft hum of Finch's voice as he discussed cuffs and collars. She had visited the shop only last month, to have a skirt hemmed. Finch had been distracted, she recalled, his usual precision marred by a nervous glance toward the back room. Had something or someone been troubling him even then, as tea drew to a close? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Jane, you're not fooling me with that innocent look. You're already puzzling this out, aren't you? You've got that glint in your eye, just like..." when you sorted out that business with the missing church funds. Miss Marple chuckled, a soft, musical sound. Oh, Dolly, you do exaggerate. I'm only an old woman who listens to what people say and what they don't say. But I will admit, this fire is curious. There's a pattern here, I'm sure of it. We just need to find the right thread to pull. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, delighted. I knew it. You'll have this solved before Craddock's even started. Will you go poking about then? Visit the suspects, perhaps. I may take another walk tomorrow, Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. The village is full of answers, if one knows where to look. Thank you for the tea, Dolly. It's been most enlightening. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Miss Marple adjusted her hat and began the slow walk back to her cottage. The village was quiet now. The smoke from the morning's fire long dispersed, but the scent of suspicion lingered. She thought of Tom Reed, his ambition perhaps outpacing his patience, of Eliza Finch, her bitterness a slow-burning ember, of Harold Vance, whose pride could mask a deeper grievance, and of Gerald Crosby, whose charm might conceal a desperate act. Each was a figure in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a small fire in the grate and settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled a case from years ago, in a neighboring village, where a fire had hidden a theft. The culprit had been a man everyone trusted, his motive buried beneath a facade of respectability. People, she knew, were rarely what they seemed. In St. Mary Mead, where every glance and gesture carried meaning, the truth about Amos Finch's death would reveal itself not in grand gestures, but in the small overlooked details. She set her needles aside and reached for a notebook, jotting down the names. Tom Reed, Eliza Finch, Harold Vance, Gerald Crosby. Beside each, she added a word or two. Ambition, resentment, pride, debt. The fire had destroyed more than a shop. It had exposed the frailties of those connected to it. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her expression serene but resolute. Tomorrow, she would begin to trace the threads, one by one, until the pattern of guilt emerged from the ashes. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead, its golden light doing little to dispel the somber mood that had settled over the village. The fire at Amos Finch's tailor shop had ignited not only flames but also a torrent of speculation, each villager weaving their own theory about the tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles tucked into her bag, accepted an invitation to tea at Gossington Hall, the sprawling home of her friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry. It was, she knew, the perfect setting to gather the threads of gossip that might lead to the truth. Gossington Hall stood at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls and manicured lawns a testament to the Bantry's comfortable, if slightly ostentatious, existence. Miss Marple, in her neat black coat and a hat adorned with a single prim feather, was ushered into the drawing-room by a flustered maid. Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a penchant for bright scarves and brighter opinions, rose from a sofa to greet her. "Jane, my dear," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her voice carrying the faintest note of excitement. "You've heard about poor Mr. Finch, of course. The whole village is in a tizzy. Come, sit, and tell me what you make of it all." She gestured to a cushioned chair Near a low table laden with a silver tea service, scones, and a pot of strawberry jam, Miss Marple settled herself, her movements deliberate, and accepted a cup of tea with a murmur of thanks. "It's a dreadful business, Dolly," she said, her voice soft but laced with a quiet intensity. "A fire like that, and Mr. Finch caught in it well. It's not the sort of thing one expects in St. Mary Mead," expects Mrs. Ban snorted, spreading jam on a scone with vigorous swipes. "It's positively sinister, Jane. They're saying it was arson, you know. Petrol, or some such thing. Inspector Craddock was here this morning, asking all sorts of questions. He's got his eye on 4 people, or so I hear. And I don't mind saying, I've got my own ideas about who might have done it." Miss Marple's eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, flickered with interest. "For people, you say? Do tell, Dolly. You know how village talk can be half truth, half fancy. But there's often a kernel of something useful in it." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her scarf slipping slightly as she warmed to her subject. "Well, there's Tom Reed, that apprentice of Finch's, a nice enough lad, but ambitious, you know. Always talking about opening his own shop in Much Benham. They say he and Finch had a proper row last week's. Something about wages or orders being botched. My cook heard it from the butcher, who heard it from Tom's aunt. And then there's Eliza Finch, the widow. A cold fish, if you ask me. Never a smile, and everyone knows she and Amos were barely civil to each other. Why, Mrs. Price at the bakery swears she saw Eliza with that grocer, Mr. Tuttle, looking far too cozy for a married woman." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind cataloguing each detail. "And the others?" she prompted gently. "Oh yes," Mrs. Bantry continued, her eyes gleaming. "There's Mr. Harold Vance, that pompous client of Finch's. You know the sort thinks he's lord of the manor because he's got a bit of money and a big house. Apparently, he and Finch had a falling out over a suit or some such nonsense. Vance claimed it was shoddy work, refused to pay, and Finch threatened to take him to court. Quite the scene, I hear, right in the shop last month. And then there's Mr. Gerald Crosby, the landlord. A slippery character, if you ask me. All charm and smiles, but my Arthur says he's up to his ears in debt. That shop was insured for a pretty penny, you know. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the handle of her teacup. "It does indeed, Dolly. Motives are like patterns in a quilt. Each piece seems separate until you see how they fit together. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. Tell me, what else did Inspector Craddock say?" Mrs. Bantry shrugged, reaching for another scone. "Oh, he's being tight-lipped as usual. Said they're looking into everyone who was close to Finch or had reason to wish him harm. But he did mention the fire started in the back room, where all those bolts of fabric were kept. Burned like tinder, apparently. Poor man didn't have a chance." She paused, her voice softening. "It's awful to think of, Jane. Amos Finch wasn't the friendliest soul, but he didn't deserve that. No one does," Miss Marple agreed, her tone somber. She set her cup down and folded her hands in her lap, her mind already weaving through the names Mrs. Bantry had provided. Tom Reed, with his dreams of independence. Eliza Finch, trapped in a loveless marriage. Harold Vance, nursing a wounded ego, and Gerald Crosby, perhaps desperate enough to see a fire as his salvation. Each had a reason to resent Amos Finch, but resentment alone did not light a match. She needed more facts, not just whispers. "Dolly," she said, her voice light but purposeful, "do you know if anyone saw anything unusual that night? A stranger near the shop, perhaps, or one of our suspects lingering where they shouldn't have been?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, delighted to be drawn deeper into the mystery. "Well, now that you mention it, my gardener, old Mr. Hobbs, was out late walking his dog. He said he saw a figure near the shop around 10 o'clock, but it was too dark to make out who it was. Could have been anyone, he said, though he thought they moved quickly, like they didn't want to be seen. And then there's Mrs. Price, again she's a terrible busybody. But she swears she saw Tom Reed walking down High Street around the same time, looking furtive, as she put it." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Mrs. Price's penchant for observation, however embellished, was a valuable resource. "Furtive," she repeated softly. "An interesting choice of word. And what of Mrs. Finch, Mr. Vance, or Mr. Crosby? Any sightings of them?" "Not that I've heard," Mrs. Bantry admitted, frowning. "But Eliza was supposed to be visiting her sister in Much Benham that night. Though, between you and me, Jane, I wouldn't be surprised if that was a fib. And Vancewell, he claims he was at the Red Lion playing cards, but you know how those men cover for each other. As for Crosby, he's always popping up where you least expect him, charming everyone with that smile of his. I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him." "You've a good heart, Tom," she said at last, her voice gentle. "But ambition can be a heavy burden. I knew a young man once, in St. Mary Mead, who wanted so badly to prove himself. He took risks he shouldn't have, thinking the ends justified the means. It didn't end well." She paused, letting the words settle. "You'd never do anything foolish, would you?" Tom's face paled, and he set the shawl down, his hands unsteady. "No, miss," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wouldn't, I swear it." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "I'm sure you wouldn't. You've done a fine job on that shawl, Tom. I'll collect it tomorrow, if that's all right." She moved toward the door, then paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. "Oh, one thing, did Mr. Finch ever mention trouble with anyone else? A client, perhaps, or his landlord? He seemed a bit distracted when I last saw him." Tom shook his head, too quickly. "No, nothing like that. He was just busy, always busy." But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with something unspoken. And Miss Marple tucked the observation away like a stray pin as she descended the stairs. The grocer, Mr. Tuttle, greeted her with a nod. A burly man with a ruddy face, he was known for his generosity and his gossip. "Terrible about Mr. Finch, isn't it, Miss Marple?" he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Tom's taking it hard, poor lad. Worked for Finch since he was a boy." "Yes, very sad," Miss Marple agreed. "Tom seems a dedicated young man. I suppose he was here often, helping with orders." "Oh, aye," Tuttle said, though he and Finch had their spats. "I heard them shouting once or twice, up in the shop. Young Tom's got big ideas, you see. Finch wasn't one for change." He lowered his voice, glancing up the stairs. "Mind you, I saw Tom that night, passing by the shop around 9. Looked in a hurry, he did. Didn't stop to chat, which isn't like him. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was alight. 9 o'clock, you say? How curious. I'm sure it was nothing important. She thanked Tuttle and stepped out into the street, her thoughts whirling like the leaves skittering across the cobbles. Tom Reed's ambition was clear, his talent evident in those bold sketches. But ambition could curdle into envy, or worse, when thwarted. His claim of being home all night was shaky, contradicted by 2 witnesses, Mrs. Price and now Mr. Tuttle, yet Miss Marple cautioned herself against hasty conclusions. A young man's restlessness did not make him an arsonist, any more than a heated argument proved intent to kill. Still, Tom's unease, his evasive glances, suggested he knew more than he was saying. As she walked home, the village clock chiming noon, Miss Marple considered her next step. Eliza Finch, the widow, was a logical choice. A woman scorned, or perhaps freed by her husband's death, might hold secrets of her own. And then there was Harold Vance, with his disputed bill, and Gerald Crosby, whose debts loomed like storm clouds. The fire, she sensed, was not just a crime but a revelation, exposing the hidden stitches in the lives of those it touched. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple determined to visit Eliza Finch next, to see what threads of truth might unravel in the widow's presence. Chapter 3. The Apprentice's Ambition. The morning after her tea with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Jane Marple set out under a sky dappled with clouds, her sturdy shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path toward the village center. St. Mary Mead was stirring into its daily rhythm, bakers kneading dough, postmen sorting letters, but the air still carried a faint whiff of charred wood, a reminder of the tragedy that had struck Amos Finch's tailor shop. Miss Marple's destination was the temporary workshop where Tom Reed, Finch's apprentice, had set up to mend the village's torn hems and frayed cuffs. She had no appointment, but in a village like this, a kindly old lady dropping by with a torn shawl needed no excuse. The workshop was a cramped room above the grocer's, lent to Tom by Mr. Tuttle, who had a soft spot for the lad. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stairs, her hand steady on the worn banister, and knocked softly. A muffled "come in" greeted her, and she entered to find Tom Reed hunched over a sewing machine, his lanky frame bent like a willow in a storm. The room was cluttered with bolts of salvaged fabric, spools of thread, and a single cracked mirror propped against the wall. Tom looked up, his dark eyes wary beneath a mop of unruly hair, and managed a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, rising awkwardly. "Didn't expect you here. Got something needs mending." He gestured to a stool, brushing a pile of pins aside. "Oh, just this old shawl," Miss Marple replied, producing a neatly folded garment from her bag. The tear was real, though conveniently timed. "I heard you were carrying on here, Tom, and I thought it only right to bring you some work. It's a sad business about Mr. Finch, isn't it?" Tom's smile faltered, and he busied himself with the shawl, examining the tear with exaggerated care. It's awful," he muttered. "Never thought I'd see the shop gone like that. Or Mr. Finch." His fingers fumbled with a needle, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands. She settled onto the stool, her expression one of gentle concern. "You must have been very fond of him, working so closely all these years. An apprentice learns so much from his master, doesn't he?" Tom shrugged, threading the needle with a focus that seemed forced. He was a good tailor. Taught me a lot, I'll give him that. But he could be particular. Liked things his way, you know. Didn't always take kindly to new ideas. His tone was careful, but Miss Marple caught the edge of resentment, sharp as a pair of shears. New ideas, she prompted, her voice as soft as the wool in her lap. You're a young man with ambition, Tom. I've heard you've dreams of your own shop one day, in much Benham, perhaps. His eyes flicked to hers, then away, as if caught in a spotlight. Talk travels fast round here, he said with a forced laugh. I've thought about it. Who wouldn't? But it's just talk. I was happy enough working for Mr. Finch. He stabbed the needle into the shawl, his movements jerky. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the cluttered table, where a sketchbook lay open. The pages were filled with designs, jackets with bold lapels, trousers with modern cut, more adventurous than Finch's conservative styles. These are yours, I take it, she said, tilting her head toward the sketches. Very impressive. You've a flair for design. Tom flushed, a mix of pride and unease. Just doodles. Mr. Finch didn't care for them. Said they were too flashy for St. Mary Mead. We had words about it now and then. He paused, then added quickly, but nothing serious. Just shop talk. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Though I understand you and Mr. Finch had a bit of a disagreement recently. About wages, was it? Or perhaps those new designs? Her question was light, almost casual, but her eyes were keen, watching the young man's face. Tom's needle paused mid-stitch, and for a moment he seemed to hold his breath. Who told you that? He asked, his voice sharper than intended. He caught himself and forced a smile. I mean, it wasn't much. He thought I was asking too much, that's all. Said I hadn't earned it yet. We sorted it out. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering a trivial matter. I'm sure you did. Young men must be patient, mustn't they? Though it's hard, when you've such talent and dreams. Where were you that night, Tom, when the fire took the shop? He stiffened, his fingers tightening on the shawl. Home, he said quickly. In my lodgings. I'd finished work early. Mr. Finch sent me off about 6. Said he had some late orders to finish. His eyes darted to the window, avoiding hers. I was in all night. Reading, mostly reading. Miss Marple echoed, her voice warm with approval. A fine way to spend an evening. Anyone see you there, I suppose? Your landlady? Perhaps. Tom hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Mrs. Carter. She's half deaf. Always in her own world. Don't think she'd notice if I was there or not. He laughed, but it was a brittle sound, and Miss Marple's smile remained serene as Tom returned to his stitching. She let the silence stretch, a tactic she knew often loosened tongues. The room was warm, the hum of the sewing machine a steady rhythm, but the air held a tension that no amount of thread could mend. She thought of Mrs. Price's claim, relayed by Mrs. Bantry, that Tom had been seen near the shop that night, looking furtive. Village busybodies were prone to exaggeration, but Mrs. Price's eyes were sharp and her memory sharper. Had Tom been at home, as he claimed, or had ambition or something darker drawn him back to High Street? Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen but kind. So they say it's a troubling thought, isn't it? That someone could do such a thing. Did Amos ever mention anyone who might have wished him harm? A client, perhaps, or someone like Mr. Crosby, the landlord. Eliza's hand froze on the poker, and for a moment she seemed to weigh her words. Amos didn't share much, but he did say Crosby was pressing him for rent, more than usual. Said he was a greedy sort. Amos' words. As for clients, there was that Mr. Vance, always complaining about his bills. Amos said he was trouble, but nothing more. She returned to her chair, her movements slower now, as if the weight of memory pressed upon her. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence linger. Eliza's bitterness was palpable, a resentment stitched into every word. Yet there was something. Elsa guardedness, perhaps, in her quick defense of her whereabouts and her dismissal of Mr. Tuttle's role. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Bantry's gossip about Eliza's cozy moments with the grocer. Gossip was often unreliable, but it could point to truths, like a shadow hinting at the shape of the object casting it. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced at the photograph on the mantel. "That's a fine likeness of Mr. Finch," she said. "He looks so serious. Was he always so?" Eliza followed her gaze, her expression softening for the first time. "He could be kind, in his way. Early on, he'd bring me flowers from the market, but the shop. It changed him, or maybe it was me who changed." She shook her head, as if shaking off a memory. "Thank you for the scones, Miss Marple. I'll manage." Miss Marple stepped into the fading light, her basket lighter but her thoughts heavier. Eliza Finch's resentment was no secret, but resentment alone did not kindle a fire. Her alibi, dependent on her sister, needed checking. Clara's vagueness, as Mrs. Bantry had hinted, was a loose thread. And then there was the mention of Crosby's pressure and Vance's complaints, each a stitch in the growing pattern. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the village green, where children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. She thought of Eliza, alone in that dim parlor, her life unraveled by a marriage that had frayed long before the fire. A woman scorned, Miss Marple knew, could act in ways both subtle and drastic. But so could a woman trapped, seeking freedom. The truth, she sensed, lay not in Eliza's words, but in what she had left unsaid. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would seek out Clara in Much Benham. A sister's testimony could confirm or unravel Eliza's story, and perhaps, along the way, she would encounter Mr. Vance, whose pride and unpaid bills suggested another motive entirely. The fire, like a poorly cut garment, had revealed the flaws in St. Mary Mead's fabric. Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would trace each seam until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 4. The wife's resentments. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting a soft glow over the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the modest cottage where Eliza Finch now resided alone. The widow's home stood at the edge of the village, a small, ivy-draped dwelling with a garden that, like its owner, seemed to have surrendered to neglect. Miss Marple, clutching a basket of homemade scones as a pretext for her visit, knocked gently on the door. Her purpose was not merely condolence but inquiry, for the whispers about Eliza Finch's unhappy marriage suggested a thread worth tugging. The door creaked open, revealing Eliza Finch, a woman whose angular features and pinched mouth seemed carved from years of disappointment. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back, accentuating the pallor of her skin, and her gray dress hung loosely, as if she had lost interest in appearances. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice flat but civil. "What brings you here?" Her eyes, shadowed with fatigue, flicked to the basket. "I thought you might appreciate a small gesture," Miss Marple said, her tone warm with practiced kindness. "It's a trying time, and a scone with tea can be a comfort. May I come in?" Eliza hesitated, then stepped aside. "Very well, mind the step." The parlor was dim, its curtains half drawn, and the air held a stale chill despite the fire smoldering in the grate. A single photograph of Amos Finch, stern and unsmiling, sat on the mantel, its frame slightly askew. Miss Marple settled into a worn armchair, placing the basket on a side table, and observed the room's sparse furnishings, a stark contrast to the tailor's meticulous shop. "I'm so very sorry about Mr. Finch," Miss Marple began, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It must be a terrible shock to lose him so suddenly, and in such a way." Eliza sat opposite, her posture rigid. "It is," she said curtly, pouring tea from a chipped pot. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, trembled slightly as she passed a cup. "Amos was a good provider, but we weren't close, as I'm sure you've heard." Her lips twisted, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Village tongues never stop, do they?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, unruffled. "They do chatter, don't they? But grief is a private thing, and no one can truly know what passes between a husband and wife. You must have cared for him deeply, all the same." Eliza's gaze dropped to her cup, her fingers tightening around it. "Cared? I suppose I did, once. But Amos lived for his shop, those bolts of cloth, his precious orders. I was just there. A seamstress in my own right, mind you, but he never saw me as more than a helper." Her voice carried a bitter edge, like a needle pricking through fabric. "He'd stay late, night after night, fussing over stitches while I sat here alone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "It's hard, isn't it, when a marriage becomes so uneven? I knew a couple once, in St. Mary Mead, where the husband was much the same, devoted to his work, blind to his wife's loneliness. It led to such unhappiness." She paused, letting the silence invite more. "Did you ever talk to Amos about how you felt?" Eliza's laugh was sharp, almost a bark. "Talk? Amos didn't talk. He'd nod, mutter something about the shop, and that was that. I stopped trying years ago." She set her cup down with a clink, her eyes darting to the window. "People think they know everything, don't they? They see me with Mr. Tuttle at the grocer's and make up stories. He's a friend, nothing more. But Amos Sammis believed the gossip, accused me of all sorts, last month, called me disloyal." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft as a whisper. "That must have been very painful, to be misunderstood like that. Where were you, Eliza, the night of the fire? It would help to know, to quiet those wagging tongues." Eliza's eyes narrowed, but she answered readily enough. "I was at my sister's in Much Benham, left in the afternoon, came back the next morning when I heard about the fire." Ask Clarice. Tell you. Her tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the hem of her dress. A nervous gesture that belied her confidence. I'm sure she will, Miss Marple said soothingly. Sisters are a comfort in times like these, though. It's odd, isn't it, how grief can blur the hours. I remember a widow in my village, so distraught she couldn't recall where she'd been for days. You're holding up remarkably well, my dear. Eliza's lips tightened, and she rose to poke at the fire, her movements abrupt. I have no choice, have I? Amos is gone, and I've got to manage. The insurance man came by yesterday asking questions. Said the shop was covered, but I don't know what's left for me. Amos handled all that. She turned, her face half lit by the fire's glow. They think someone said it, don't they? The police, I mean. As she stepped out into the crisp air, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz. Harold Vance's bluster was a thin veneer over unease, his quick temper a warning flag. His alibi, a card game at the Red Lion, seemed convenient, yet she recalled Mrs. Banter's hint that his companions, Dr. Haydock and Mr. Lumley, had been vague when questioned by Inspector Men, she knew, often covered for one another, especially over cards and ale, and the dispute over the jacket, while petty, suggested a man whose pride could flare into something more dangerous. She paused by the village green, where a group of children chased a hoop under the watchful eye of a nursemaid. Vance's wealth, she mused, was a curious thing. He flaunted it his gold watch, his tailored suits, yet there was a rumor, whispered at Mrs. Bantry's tea, that his finances were not as robust as he let on. A man in debt, humiliated by a tailor's bill, might act rashly to save face, but rashly enough to set a fire. That remained to be seen. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ledger, partially recovered from the fire's wreckage, which Inspector Craddock had mentioned. It showed no record of Vance's payment, despite his insistence that he had settled the bill. A lie, perhaps, or a misunderstanding. Either way, it was a loose thread, and Miss Marple was not one to let such things dangle as she made her way home. She decided her next step would be to speak with Dr. Haydock or Mr. Lumley, to test the strength of Vance's alibi. And then there was Gerald Crosby, the landlord, whose financial straits and insured property loomed ever larger in her mind. The fire, she sensed, was a deliberate act, its flames revealing more than they consumed. With each conversation, Miss Marple was stitching together a pattern, one that would soon reveal the hand that had struck the match. Chapter 5. The Client's Complaint. Morning mist had barely lifted from St. Mary Mead when Miss Jane Marple set out for the Red Lion, the village's only inn, where Mr. Harold Vance was known to take his midday meal. The cobbled streets were quiet, save for the clatter of a milk cart and the distant bark of a dog. Miss Marple, in her familiar tweed coat and a hat pinned with a modest brooch, carried a small parcel, a pair of gloves needing repair, a plausible excuse for a visit. Her true purpose, however, was to unravel the thread of Mr. Vance's dispute with Amos Finch, a quarrel that village gossip had spun into a motive for murder. The Red Lion stood at the heart of the village, its timbered facade and swinging sign a beacon for travelers and locals alike. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ale and roasted meat, and the low hum of conversation filled the taproom. Mr. Vance, a stout man with a florid complexion and a penchant for loud waistcoats, sat alone at a corner table, a half-eaten plate of shepherd's pie before him. His gold watch chain glinted as he glanced up, his expression shifting from irritation to guarded politeness at the sight of Miss Marple. "Good day, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was passing by and thought you might know a good tailor to mend these gloves. Poor Mr. Finch's loss has left us all at 6s and 7s, hasn't it?" Vance dabbed his mouth with a napkin, his small eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Sit, if you like." He gestured to a chair, his tone more command than invitation. "A bad business, Finch's death. Shocking, really. But I'm no tailor, and I doubt I can help with your gloves. Try young Tom. Reed he's set up above Tuttle's shop." Miss Marple settled into the chair, placing the parcel on the table. "Oh, I've seen Tom, and he's doing his best. But it's not the same, is it? Mr. Finch had such a way with his work. I understand. You were one of his clients. A man of your standing must have valued his skill." Vance puffed out his chest, clearly pleased by the flattery, though his smile was tight. "I did, at first. Finch made a decent suit, I'll give him that. But his last job, a jacket, bespoke, was a disgrace. Poorly cut, shoddy stitching. I told him I wouldn't pay a penny for it, and he had the gall to threaten me with legal nonsense. He thumped the table, drawing a glance from the barmaid. Miss Marple's eyes widened in sympathetic surprise, though her mind was sharp as ever. "How distressing," she said. "A disagreement over work can be so trying. I suppose you sorted it out, though. A gentleman like you would hardly let such a matter fester." Vance snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Sorted hardly. Finch was stubborn as a mule. Claimed I owed him £50 when the jacket wasn't fit for a scarecrow. I told him where he could shove his bill, and that was that." His voice carried a bluster, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers toyed with his watch chain, a nervous tick that belied his bravado. "And when was this?" she asked, her tone light, as if merely curious. "It must have been quite recent." With the fire happening so soon after, Vance's gaze flickered, and he took a long sip of his ale before answering. "A few weeks back, maybe 3. We had words in his shop, loud ones, I'll admit, but I didn't set foot there again. The night of the fire, I was here, playing cards with Dr. Haydock and Mr. Lumley. Ask them, they'll vouch for me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Cards at the Red Lion's such a pleasant way to pass an evening, though I suppose you were all quite caught up in the game. Did you stay late?" "Till near midnight," Vance said quickly, though his eyes darted to the side. "Plenty of folks saw me. No shortage of witnesses in a place like this." He gestured vaguely at the tap room, now filling with lunchtime patrons. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "It's a comfort to know where people were when such a tragedy struck. Poor Mr. Finch must have been working late, alone in that shop. Did he ever mention any other troubles to you? With his apprentice, perhaps, or his landlord?" Vance's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. Finch wasn't one for chatter, but he did grumble about that landlord of his, Crosby. Said the man was always hounding him for rent, raising it every chance he got. As for The apprentice tome is it. Finch called him a dreamer, always sketching fancy designs instead of focusing. Didn't sound like he trusted the lad much. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if struck by a passing thought. How interesting. Mr. Crosby does seem to have a reputation for persistence. And young Tom, well, ambition can be a tricky thing. I knew a man once, in another village, who let a business dispute turn into something quite dreadful. Pride, you see, can make people act so unwisely. Her voice was soft, but her eyes held Vance's. Searching for a reaction, he shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening on the watch chain. Pride's got nothing to do with it, he snapped. Finch tried to cheat me, and I wouldn't stand for it, but I didn't burn his shop down, if that's what you're getting at. I'm no criminal. His voice rose, drawing a curious glance from a nearby farmer. Oh, my dear Mr. Vance, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, I'd never suggest such a thing. I'm only an old woman, trying to make sense of a sad affair. You've been most helpful. She rose, gathering her parcel. I'll leave you to your meal. Perhaps I'll try Tom for these gloves after all. Hodges nodded, stamping the card with a practiced hand. That he is, Miss Marple. Always smiling, but there's talk he's in deep with the bank. Owes more than he lets on. Why, just last week, he was in here asking me to send a letter to his insurance firm in London. Urgent, he said. Day before the fire, that was. He lowered his voice, leaning closer. Not that I'm one to gossip, mind. Of course not, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. You're a model of discretion, Mr. Hodges, though it's curious, isn't it, how things happen so close together. Did you see Mr. Crosby that night, by any chance? Hodges shook his head. Not me, but my nephew, young Billy, was out late with his mates. Said he saw Crosby walking near High Street, not far from the shop, around 10. Looked like he was in a hurry, Billy said. Didn't stop to chat, which isn't like him. Miss Marple thanked Hodges and stepped out into the evening air, her thoughts as tangled as a skein of wool. Crosby's charm was a polished facade, but beneath it lay desperation. His debts, the insured shop, his presence near the scene were stitches in a pattern that pointed to motive. Yet she cautioned herself against haste. A man in debt might act rashly, but so might a man with a grudge, like Harold Vance, or a woman with a broken heart. Like Eliza Finch, as she walked home, the village lamps flickering to life, Miss Marple recalled a case from years ago, when a merchant in a neighboring town had burned his failing shop for the insurance money, only to be caught by a stray receipt, left in the ashes. Crosby's inquiry to his insurance firm, so close to the fire, was no mere coincidence. And Billy's sighting of him near the shop added another layer to the puzzle. She paused by her garden gate, the scent of lavender mingling with the evening chill. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would visit Mrs. Crosby, whose testimony might confirm or unravel her husband's alibi. And perhaps a word with Inspector Craddock would yield more about the insurance policy. The fire, Miss Marple knew, was not just a crime but a mirror, reflecting the hidden flaws of those it touched. With each step, she was closer to seeing the whole design, and she would not rest until the truth was neatly sewn. Chapter 6. The Landlord's Ledger. The late afternoon light filtered through the elms of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled shadows on the path as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the post office. The village was settling into its evening hush, with only the occasional clink of teacups or the laughter of children breaking the quiet. Her destination was not for stamps or parcels, but for a chance encounter with Mr. Gerald Crosby, the landlord of Amos Finch's ill-fated shop. Village gossip painted him as a man teetering on the edge of ruin, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for hidden truths, suspected his financial woes might hold the key to the fire's mystery. The post office, a squat building with a cheerfully painted sign, was a hub of village life, where letters and rumors were exchanged with equal fervor. Mr. Hodges, the postmaster, stood behind the counter, sorting mail with the precision of a clockmaker. Miss Marple, her basket now empty of scones and gloves, entered with a smile, her eyes scanning the room. There, near a rack of newspapers, stood Gerald Crosby, his broad shoulders and practiced charm unmistakable. He was chatting with a young clerk, his laughter a touch too hearty, his smile a shade too wide. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crosby," Miss Marple said, approaching with the air of an old friend. "I was just passing and thought I'd see how the village is faring after such a dreadful week. Poor Mr. Finch's loss has us all shaken, hasn't it?" Crosby turned, his expression flickering from surprise to geniality. "Miss Marple." "Always a pleasure," he said, his voice smooth as polished. He was a tall man, with a ruddy complexion and hair that was beginning to gray at the temples, though his tailored coat and gleaming cufflinks suggested a prosperity that village whispers contradicted. A terrible thing, that fire, poor Finch. "I still can't believe it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "Nor can I, his shop was such a fixture on High Street." "You must feel the loss keenly, being his landlord. I understand the property was quite valuable." Crosby's smile tightened, and he adjusted his cufflinks with a casual air that seemed forced. "Valuable, yes, in its way. But it's a blow. You know, losing a tenant like Finch. Reliable, he was, always paid his rent on time." He paused, then added, "Well, mostly." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone one of mild curiosity. "I'd have thought Mr. Finch was punctual." "To a fault. A man so precise with his stitches must have been the same with his obligations." Crosby chuckled, though it lacked warmth. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But he'd been a bit behind lately." "Not much. Mind, just a month or two. I was patient, of course. Didn't want to press a man like Finch." He waved a hand, as if dismissing the matter, but Miss Marple noted the slight sheen of perspiration on his brow. "How kind of you," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "Not all landlords would be so understanding. I suppose the insurance will help, though. I've heard properties like that are well covered, especially in a village like ours." Crosby's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing his face before his smile returned. "Insurance. Oh yes, there's a policy, but these things take time. Forms, inspections, it's a headache, Miss Marple. I'd rather have Finch alive and stitching, believe me." He glanced at the clock above the counter, as if eager to change the subject. "Now, what brings you here?" "Posting a letter." "Just a small errand," Miss Marple said, producing a postcard from her bag. "Though I confess, I do enjoy a chat at the post office. One hears such interesting things. Why, only yesterday, Someone mentioned you'd been asking about insurance matters just before the fire. Quite a coincidence, isn't it? Crosby's smile froze, and for a moment, his charm seemed to crack like thin ice. Who said that? He asked, his voice sharp before he caught himself. I mean, it's no secret I keep my properties insured. A landlord's got to be prudent, hasn't he? I might have spoken to my agent last week. Routine business, nothing more, of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Prudence is so important. I knew a landlord once, in a village not unlike this one, who insured everything to the hilt. Turned out he'd planned a little fire of his own. But I'm sure that's not your way, Mr. Crosby. You're far too respected for that. Crosby's laugh was forced, and he shifted his weight, glancing toward the door. Respected or not, I've no time for nonsense like that. I was home the night of the fire with my wife. She'll tell you the same. Now, if you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I've business to attend to. He tipped his hat, his movements brisk, and made for the exit. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression serene but her mind alight. Crosby's unease was palpable, his quick deflection of the insurance question a thread she intended to pull. She turned to Mr. Hodges, who had been listening with the discreet curiosity of a man accustomed to village secrets. Mr. Crosby seems a busy man, she remarked, handing him the postcard. Always rushing about, isn't he? Chapter 7. A pattern emerges. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's cottage as she sat by her fire. A notebook open on the table before her. Outside, St. Mary Mead slumbered under a star-streaked sky, but within her mind was a whirl of threads, suspicions, motives, and half-glimpsed truths, each waiting to be woven into a coherent pattern. The fire that had claimed Amos Finch's shop and life was no random act, she was certain. And the suspects Tom read, Eliza Finch, Harold Vance, and Gerald Crosby each held a piece of the puzzle. Her knitting lay abandoned in its basket. For tonight her needles were her thoughts, stitching together the fragments of the past day's conversations. Miss Marple's notebook was a study in precision, its pages filled with neat, spidery handwriting. Beside each suspect's name, she had jotted observations. Tom Reed, ambition, evasive, seen near shop. Eliza Finch, bitter, alibi uncertain. Harold Vance, bride, disputed bill, weak alibi. Gerald Crosby, debts, insurance inquiry, near shop. She tapped her pencil against the page, her eyes narrowing as she considered the common thread. Each had a grievance, a reason to wish Amos Finch harm. Yet the fire's deliberate nature, its origin in the back room, fueled by petrol, suggested a calculated mind, not a fleeting impulse. She leaned back, her gaze drifting to the fire's flicker. The case reminded her of an incident years ago, in St. Mary Mead, when a grocer's shed had burned to conceal a theft. The culprit, a seemingly respectable clerk, had been undone by a single overlooked detail, a charred invoice bearing his name. Miss Marple suspected a similar oversight might lurk in the ashes of Finch's shop. The precision of the fire's start, as Inspector Craddock had described, pointed to planning, perhaps by someone familiar with the shop's layout. Tom, as apprentice, knew it well. Eliza, as wife, better still. Vance had been a frequent client, and Crosby, as landlord, had every reason to visit. But motive, she reminded herself, was not enough. She needed evidence, a stitch to hold the pattern together. Rising, she poured a fresh cup of tea from the pot Lily had left warming. The village clock chimed 9, its notes faint through the closed windows. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts returning to Crosby's nervous deflection at the post office. His inquiry about insurance, so close to the fire, was a glaring coincidence, and young Billy's sighting of him near High Street added weight to her suspicions. Yet Tom's furtive presence, as reported by Mrs. Price and Mr. Tuttle, could not be dismissed. Eliza's trembling hands and vague alibi hinted at secrets, and Vance's bluster masked a pride that might have flared into violence. Each suspect was a thread, but which had been pulled to unravel Amos Finch's life. She turned a page in her notebook, jotting a new heading: the fire itself. Inspector Craddock had mentioned the back room, where bolts of fabric had fueled the blaze. Miss Marple recalled visiting the shop, the narrow space cluttered with shelves of linen and wool, the workbench where Finch labored late. The back room, she remembered, had a small window, often left ajar for ventilation. A perfect entry for an arsonist or a way to ensure the fire spread quickly. She made a note to ask Craddock if the window had been checked for signs of tampering. Her thoughts shifted to the ledger, partially salvaged from the wreckage. It had shown no record of Vance's claimed payment, a point that nagged at her. Was Vance lying to save face, or had Finch, meticulous as he was, made an error? Or perhaps the ledger itself held a clue. Numbers, she knew, could reveal as much as words. She resolved to ask Craddock for a closer look, perhaps under the guise of offering her own observations on village bookkeeping. The clock chimed again, marking the half-hour, and Miss Marple's mind turned to Eliza's sister, Clara, in Much Benham. Eliza's alibi rested on Clara's word, yet Mrs. Bantry's hint of vagueness suggested a flaw in the seam. A visit to Much Benham was in order, but it would have to wait until morning. For now, Miss Marple decided to revisit the scene of the crime. The ruins, she suspected, might hold more than ash and sorrow. With Inspector Craddock's permission, a walk through the wreckage could reveal a detail overlooked in the initial chaos. She closed her notebook and rose, slipping it into a drawer. The fire in her grate crackled, a small echo of the blaze that had changed St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple thought of Amos Finch, his life reduced to cinders, and felt a quiet determination settle over her. Human nature, she knew, was as predictable as it was flawed: greed, pride, resentment, ambition, all threads in a tapestry of motive. The fire had been set to hide something, or to gain something, and the truth lay in the interplay of those desires. The next morning, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her step brisk despite the early chill. She sent a note to Inspector Craddock, requesting a visit to the shop's remains, and made her way to the police station, a small building near the village hall. Craddock, his face lined with the fatigue of a case with too many suspects, greeted her with a wry smile. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a chair. "I should have known you'd be back. Got a theory already, I suppose?" "Oh, Inspector," she replied, her voice light, "I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands. But I was wondering if I might see the shop, or what's left of it. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes notices what others miss." Craddock raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Can't hurt, I suppose." The fire brigade's done their bit, and we've got men sifting through the debris. But it's a grim sight, Miss Marple. Sure you're up for it?" "I've seen grim sights before," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "And I knew Mr. Finch. It feels only right to pay my respects, in a way." An hour later, they stood before the blackened skeleton of the tailor's shop. The air still carried the acrid scent of smoke, and the once neat facade was a chaos of charred beams and shattered glass. Police tape fluttered in the breeze, and a constable stood guard, nodding to Craddock as they approached. Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene, taking in the collapsed roof, the melted remnants of a sewing machine, and the sodden piles of fabric spilling onto the pavement. "Started in the back, you said?" she asked, stepping carefully over a puddle of ash-streaked water. Craddock nodded, leading her to what remained of the back room. "Here," he said, pointing to a scorched corner where shelves had once stood. "The fire brigade found traces of petrol poured along the base of these walls. Whoever did it knew the fabric would catch fast. Finch was found there." He gestured to a spot near the workbench. Now a tangle of metal and wood. "Didn't have a chance." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the workbench, then moved to the small window, its frame warped but intact. "Was this open when the fire started?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. Craddock frowned, consulting his notebook. "The brigade didn't say. It's closed now, but the heat could have warped it shut." "Why, oh, just a thought," she said, peering at the window's latch. It was blackened but appeared undamaged, suggesting it had been closed before the fire grew fierce. An arsonist entering through it would have left mark scratches, perhaps, or a broken catch. She made a mental note to ask the fire brigade for details as they moved through the wreckage. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glint beneath a fallen beam. She bent, her movements slow but deliberate, and pointed. "Inspector, what's that?" Craddock crouched, brushing aside ash to reveal a fragment of glass, its edge jagged and bearing a partial label. "Looks like a bottle," he said, lifting it carefully. "Could be nothing, or it could be what held the petrol. I'll have it sent for analysis." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A bottle, carelessly left, was the sort of mistake a desperate man might make. Or a clever one, hoping to point suspicion elsewhere. She thought of Crosby, his debts a heavy weight, and of Tom, whose ambition might have outstripped his patience. Eliza's bitterness and Vance's pride lingered in her thoughts. But the bottle, if it held petrol, was a tangible clue, a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. As they left the ruins, Miss Marple glanced back at the shop, its blackened frame, a stark reminder of the life lost within. "Thank you, Inspector," she said. "It's a sad place, but it tells a story, doesn't it?" Craddock smiled, a touch of admiration in his eyes. "You see more than most, Miss Marple. If you spot anything else, you'll let me know." "Of course," she said, her smile serene. "I'm only an old woman, but I do notice things." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple added the bottle to her notebook, along with a question about the window's latch. The pattern was emerging, each suspect's motives and movements forming a design. Tomorrow, she would visit Clara in Much Benham to test Eliza's alibi, and perhaps speak with Mrs. Crosby to probe her husband's story. The fire, she knew, was a deliberate act, its flames illuminating the hidden corners of St. Mary Mead's heart. With quiet resolve, Miss Marple closed her notebook, ready to pull the next thread. Chapter 8. Ashes and Answers. The morning sun rose pale over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through a veil of clouds that mirrored the village's subdued mood. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a cup of tea and a slice of toast, set out early to revisit the ruins of Amos Finch's tailor shop, this time with a sharper purpose. Her visit the previous day with Inspector Craddock had yielded a tantalizing clue, a fragment of a glass bottle, possibly the vessel for the petrol that fueled the fatal fire. Today, she hoped to uncover more, to find the overlooked detail that would tighten the weave of her suspicions. Her notebook, tucked into her basket, held the names of the suspects: Dome Reed, Eliza Finch, Harold Vance, and Gerald Crosby, each a thread in a tapestry she was determined to complete. The high street was quiet, the charred skeleton of the shop standing like a mournful sentinel amidst the bustling normalcy of the bakery and post office. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, and a single constable, young and yawning, stood guard. Miss Marple approached, her smile as disarming as ever, and explained she had Inspector Craddock's permission to look again, citing her sentimental wish to honor poor Mr. Finch. The constable, lulled by her gentle demeanor, waved her through, though he kept a lazy eye on her movements. Miss Marple stepped carefully over the debris, her sensible shoes crunching on ash and splintered wood. The air still carried the acrid bite of smoke, though the fire brigade had doused the last embers days ago. She made her way to the back room, where the fire had begun, her eyes scanning the wreckage with the precision of a seamstress inspecting a hem. The collapsed shelves, once laden with bolts of fabric, were a tangle of blackened timber, and the workbench where Finch had met his end was barely recognizable. Yet it was the small window, its frame warped but intact, that drew her attention. Again, she bent closer, her fingers brushing the latch, noting its lack of scratches or forced entry. If an arsonist had entered here, they had been careful, or had a key. As she straightened, a glint caught her eye, half buried beneath a pile of sodden fabric near the workbench. She knelt, her movements slow to avoid the constable's notice, and brushed aside the debris. There, in the ash, lay a singed scrap of paper, its edges curled but legible. It was a receipt, bearing the letterhead of a London insurance firm, Crosby and Sons, Ltd., only days before the fire. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. She slipped the receipt into her pocket, resolving to show it to Craddock later. It was not proof, but it was a stitch, a link to Gerald Crosby's desperate inquiries about his policy. She rose, dusting her hands, and turned her attention to the floor near the shelves. The fire brigade had confirmed the blaze started here, with petrol splashed along the base. Miss Marple pictured the scene, a dark figure, bottle in hand, moving swiftly in the night. The precision suggested familiarity with the shop's layout. Tom, as apprentice, or Eliza, as wife, would know it intimately. But Crosby, as landlord, had access to, and his debts loomed large. Vance, less familiar, seemed an unlikely candidate for such a calculated act, though his temper could not be dismissed. As she moved toward the front of the shop, her eyes caught another anomalia, small charred metal tin, tucked beneath a fallen beam. It was the sort used for storing receipts or small tools, and its lid was ajar, revealing a glimpse of papers inside. Miss Marple glanced at the constable, who was now chatting with a passing milkman, and carefully lifted the tin. Inside were a few singed documents, including a note in Finch's meticulous hand. Crosby rent increase disputed, threatens eviction. The date was recent, a week before the fire. Another thread, tying Crosby closer to the motive of financial desperation. Miss Marple replaced the tin, her mind racing. The receipt and the note were not enough to convict, but they strengthened the pattern pointing to Crosby. His charm, his debts, his presence near the shop wall, were aligning like stitches in a seam, yet she cautioned herself against haste. Tom's evasiveness, Eliza's bitterness, and Vance's pride were still threads in play, each with its own pull. The bottle fragment, now with Craddock for analysis, might yield more, perhaps a fingerprint, or a trace of its contents. She left the ruins, nodding to the constable, and made her way to the police station to share her findings. Inspector was in his office, surrounded by reports, his expression one of weary determination. "Miss Marple," he greeted, rising. "Back so soon. Found something in that ruin, I take it." "Oh, just a small thing," she said, producing the receipt, with a delicate flourish. This was in the ashes, near the workbench. "It's from Mr. Crosby's insurance firm, dated rather close to the fire. And there's a tin with a note in Mr. Finch's hand, mentioning a dispute with Crosby over rent. I thought you'd want to see it." Craddock's eyes widened as he examined the receipt. "This is something, all right." Crosby didn't mention any recent disputes, and he was cagey about his insurance talks. "We'll fetch that tin and have a look. Anything else catch your eye?" Miss Marple hesitated, then mentioned the window latch. "It's undamaged, Inspector. If someone entered that way, they were very careful, or had a key. Perhaps you could ask the fire brigade if they noted its state when they arrived." Craddock jotted a note, his respect for her growing. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll have the lads check the latch, and we'll test that bottle fragment. If it's petrol, and if we can tie it to anyone." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You've given us a start." As Miss Marple left the station, her thoughts turned to her next move. Eliza's alibi needed testing, and a visit to Clara in Much Benham was overdue. But Crosby's shadow loomed larger now, his financial straits and timely insurance inquiries forming a pattern too stark to ignore. She recalled a case in a neighboring village, where a landlord had torched his own property to escape debt, only to be undone by a careless letter. Crosby's receipt might be his undoing, but she needed more, perhaps a word with Mrs. Crosby, or a closer look at the shop's lease. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple added the receipt and note to her notebook, underlining Crosby with a firm stroke. The fire, she knew, was a deliberate act, its flames a mirror to the motives it exposed. With each clue, the pattern grew clearer, and she felt the quiet thrill of nearing the truth. Tomorrow, she would pursue Clara's testimony and perhaps cross paths with Mrs. Crosby. The tapestry of St. Mary Mead's secrets was unraveling, and Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, would not rest until every thread was in place. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, hinting at autumn's approach. As Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her notebook open beside a pot of cooling tea. The clues gathered from the Tailor shop's ruins, the glass bottle fragment, the singed insurance receipt, and Amos Finch's note about Gerald Crosby's rent demands had tightened the weave of her suspicions. Yet the pattern remained incomplete, with threads still dangling. Tom Reed's furtive presence near the shop, Eliza Finch's uncertain alibi, and Harold Vance's flimsy card game story. Miss Marple knew that to unravel the truth, she needed to tug gently but firmly, and a subtle trap, baited with village curiosity, might just do the trick. She sipped her tea, her eyes tracing the notes in her precise handwriting. Crosby's financial desperation, coupled with his proximity to the shop on the night of the fire, made him the most likely to have struck the match. But suspicion was not proof, and Miss Marple was too seasoned to let her instincts outrun evidence. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a thief had been caught by a whispered rumor of a witness, prompting a confession. A similar tactic, she decided, might shake loose the truth about Amos Finch's death. Miss Marple sent a note to Inspector Craddock, suggesting a discreet plan. She proposed that word be spread quietly through the village's reliable gossip channels that a witness had seen a man carrying a bottle near the shop before the fire. The rumor would be vague enough to avoid alarm, but pointed enough to unsettle the guilty. Mrs. Bantry, with her knack for spreading news, was the perfect conduit. Miss Marple telephoned her friend, her voice light but purposeful. "Dolly," she said, "I've been thinking about poor Mr. Finch. There's talk of a witness seeing someone near the shop that night, with a bottle in hand. I thought you might have heard something. People do confide in you." Mrs. Bantry, delighted to be at the center of intrigue, seized the bait. "A witness? Oh, Jane, that's news. No one's said a word to me, but I'll make sure they do. A bottle, you say? That's suspicious, isn't it?" She promised to share the tidbit at the village hall's sewing circle that afternoon, a gathering known for its rapid dissemination of news. By midday, the rumor had taken root. Miss Marple, strolling through the village with her basket, overheard whispers at the bakery and post office. A man with a bottle, near the shop, just before the fire. She smiled faintly, knowing the seed was sown. Her next step was to observe the suspects, to see who flinched under the weight of this new scrutiny. A village meeting, scheduled that evening to discuss the upcoming fate, offered the perfect opportunity. The village hall was a modest building, its walls adorned with faded posters and a notice board cluttered with announcements. By 7 o'clock, it was filled with familiar faces: Mrs. Price, Mr. Tuttle, Dr. Haydock, and a dozen others chatting over cups of weak tea. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her knitting in her lap, her eyes scanning the room. Tom Reed was there, fidgeting in a corner, his lanky frame hunched, as if to avoid notice. Eliza Finch, pale and withdrawn, sat near her sister Clara, who had come from Much Benham. Harold Vance stood by the tea-urn, his loud voice dominating a conversation about cricket, and Gerald Crosby, ever the charmer, circulated with a smile. Though Miss Marple noted the strain in his eyes, the meeting began with the vicar droning on about fate logistics. But the undercurrent of gossip was palpable. Mrs. Price, her voice carrying, mentioned the witness to a neighbor, and Miss Marple watched the suspect's reactions. Tom's head snapped up, his fingers twisting a button on his jacket. Eliza's lips tightened, her hand gripping Clara's arm. Vance, mid-sentence, faltered, his eyes darting toward the door. But it was Crosby who betrayed the most. His smile freezing as he overheard Mrs. Price. He excused himself from a conversation and approached the vicar, his voice low but insistent. "There's no truth to this witness nonsense, is there?" Crosby said, his tone too sharp for the casual setting. "People are saying someone saw a man with a bottle. It's ridiculous stirring up trouble for no reason." The vicar flustered, murmured something vague, but Miss Marple's ears caught every word. Crosby's agitation was a thread pulled taut, and she resolved to tug harder. She rose, her movements slow, and approached Inspector Craddock, who stood near the entrance, observing the crowd. "Inspector," she said softly, "Mr. Crosby seems quite unsettled by the talk of a witness. Perhaps it's time to ask him a few questions gently, of course. And I wonder if you've spoken to young Tom again. He's looking rather nervous tonight." Craddock nodded, his expression one of grudging admiration. "You've got a nose for this, Miss Marple. I'll have a word with Crosby. As for Tom, we've been digging. Turns out he wasn't at home all night, as he claimed. His landlady, Mrs. Carter, says he left around 8 and didn't return till after midnight. And—" he lowered his voice. "The bottle fragment tested positive for petrol. No fingerprints, but it's a start." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "How interesting. And that receipt I found any word from the insurance firm?" "They confirmed Crosby inquired about the shop's policy days before the fire," Craddock said. "Claimed he was reviewing his assets. We're checking his bank records now. Looks like he's in deeper than he lets on. Loans defaulted, creditors circling." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion drew their attention. Tom Reed, his face flushed, approached Craddock, his voice trembling. "Inspector, I need to tell you something. I wasn't honest before. I did go back to the shop that night, just to pick up some sketches I'd left. But I saw something Mr. Crosby, outside, near the back alley. He was holding something, looked like a bottle. I didn't think much of it then, but with this witness talk—" He trailed off, his eyes wide with fear. Craddock's brow furrowed, and he glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Tom," he said. "We'll need a full statement. Stay here." He moved toward Crosby, who was now deep in conversation with Dr. Haydock. His gestures animated. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting needles clicking softly. Tom's admission was a new stitch, tying Crosby closer to the scene. Yet she wondered if fear, not guilt, had prompted the boy's confession. Had he been coerced, or simply scared by the spreading rumor? Eliza, sitting stiffly beside Clara, seemed unmoved by the whispers, her alibi still untested. Vance, meanwhile, had resumed his bluster, but his earlier hesitation lingered in Miss Marple's mind as the meeting wound down. Craddock approached Crosby, his tone polite but firm. "Mr. Crosby, a word, if you please. There's talk of a witness seeing someone near the shop. Care to clarify where you were that night?" Crosby's face reddened, and he laughed, too loudly. "I told you, Inspector, I was home with my wife. This witness business is nonsense. Who's spreading it? I've a right to know." His voice drew eyes, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. "We're just following leads, Craddock said calmly. We'll need to speak with Mrs. Crosby again. Routine, you understand. Crosby muttered something and stalked off, his charm unraveling like a poorly sewn hem. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind weaving the new threads. Tom's sighting, Crosby's agitation, the petrol-laced bottle. The trap had worked, stirring the guilty to reveal themselves. But she needed one final piece of confirmation of Crosby's motive. Perhaps through his wife, or a slip in his carefully crafted facade. As she left the hall, the night air cool against her face, Miss Marple felt the pattern nearing completion. Tomorrow, she would visit Mrs. Crosby and confirm Eliza's alibi with Clara. The fire, she knew, had been set to conceal a deeper intent, and Gerald Crosby's desperation was the brightest thread in the tapestry. With quiet resolve, she walked home, ready to pull the final stitch that would lay the truth bare. Chapter 10. The Confession. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle mist, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and cobblestone lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her modest breakfast table, reviewed her notebook with the precision of a tailor measuring cloth. The trap set at the village meeting had yielded results. Gerald Crosby's agitation, Tom Reed's belated admission, and the growing weight of evidence, the petrol-laced bottle fragment, the insurance receipt, and Amos Finch's note about Crosby's rent demands pointed firmly toward the landlord. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion, however well-founded, was not proof. To seal the pattern, she needed a confession, and the morning's plan was to tighten the threads around Crosby until they snapped. She had arranged to meet Inspector Craddock at the police station, where he had promised to share the latest findings from Crosby's bank records and the fire brigade's report. As she donned her coat and hat, her step was brisk, her mind alight with the clarity that comes when a puzzle nears its solution. The village was stirring, bakers unloading flour sacks, children scampering to school, but Miss Marple's focus was on the Crosby household, where she hoped a conversation with Mrs. Crosby might unravel her husband's alibi. At the station, Craddock greeted her with a nod, his desk cluttered with papers and a half-drunk cup of tea. "Miss Marple," he said, a hint of admiration in his tired eyes, "your witness rumor stirred things up. Crosby's been calling, insisting we clear his name, but we've got something solid now." He slid a bank statement across the desk. "Crosby's in debt to the tune of thousands, mortgages on 3 properties, including Finch's shop, and a loan defaulted last month. The insurance on the shop would have covered it all, with plenty to spare." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the figures, her lips pursing. "Desperation makes men reckless, Inspector. And that receipt I found has the insurance firm confirmed its purpose." Craddock nodded. "They did. Crosby requested a payout estimate for fire damage 3 days before the blaze. Claimed it was hypothetical. We've also got the fire brigade's report. The window latch in the back room was closed. No signs of tampering. Whoever set the fire likely had a key or knew the shop was unlocked." Miss Marple's thoughts flickered to Crosby's access as landlord, and Tom's statement. She asked, "He saw Crosby with a bottle that night. Has he added anything more?" "He's sticking to his story," Craddock said. "Says he was too scared to mention it earlier, thought Crosby might come after him. We're bringing Crosby in for questioning today. Care to sit in? Your presence might unsettle him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. I'd be happy to observe, Inspector. Sometimes a quiet old lady in the corner can prompt the truth. By noon, Gerald Crosby sat in the station's small interview room, his usual charm replaced by a strained defiance. His suit, though still well cut, seemed to hang on him, as if his confidence had shrunk. Miss Marple took a seat near the door, her knitting in her lap, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Craddock, flanked by a constable, began with a calm but pointed tone. "Mr. Crosby," he said, "we've got evidence that places you near Finch's shop the night of the fire. A witness saw you with a bottle, and we've found a petrol-laced fragment in the wreckage. Care to explain?" Crosby's face reddened, his hands clenching on the table. "This is absurd. I was home with my wife. Ask her. That witness is mistaken. I wasn't anywhere near High Street that night." Miss Marple. Needles clicked softly, her eyes fixed on Crosby's twitching jaw. Craddock leaned forward, producing the singed receipt. "This was found in the shop, from your insurance firm, dated days before the fire. You inquired about a payout, and your bank records show you're drowning in debt. The shop's insurance would have solved that, wouldn't it?" Crosby's eyes darted to the receipt, then to Miss Marple, who met his gaze with serene curiosity. "That's nothing," he snapped. "Routine business. I check my policies regularly. You can't pin this on me based on some scrap of paper. And this," Craddock slid Finch's note across the table, detailing the rent dispute. "Finch wrote that you threatened eviction. Sounds like you were desperate for cash." Crosby's composure cracked, his voice rising. "Finch was behind on rent. I had every right to press him, but I didn't burn his shop. I'd never." He stopped, his breath ragged, as if realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice soft but piercing. "Mr. Crosby, I knew a man once, in another village, who thought a fire would erase his troubles. He planned it carefully, but he didn't count on someone being inside. It weighed on him, you know, that mistake. It always does." Her eyes held his, gentle but unrelenting. Crosby's face crumpled, his hands covering his eyes. "I didn't mean for him to die," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought the shop was empty. Finch was supposed to be gone home, or with his wife. I just needed the insurance money. The bank was going to take everything, my home, my properties. I poured the petrol, lit the match. But I swear, I didn't know he was there." Craddock exchanged a glance with the constable, who began taking notes. "Go on, Mr. Crosby," Craddock said, his tone steady. "Tell us exactly what happened." Crosby's confession spilled out like thread from a broken spool. He had waited until dark, believing Finch had left for the evening. Using his landlord's key, he entered the back room, splashed petrol from a bottle he'd brought, and set the fire. He fled through the alley, assuming the blaze would be blamed on faulty wiring or an accident. "I never meant to kill him," he repeated, his voice hollow. "It was just the shop, just money." Miss Marple's needles paused, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. Greed, she knew, was a clumsy tailor, stitching plans that unraveled under scrutiny. Crosby's desperation had cost a life, a tragic miscalculation born of panic. Craddock signaled for the constable to escort Crosby to a cell, then turned to Miss Marple. "You did it again," he said, shaking his head. "That rumor about the witness, it broke him. How did you know? Oh, Inspector, she said, tucking her knitting away. I only know people. Mr. Crosby's charm was a thin thread, and guilt frays even the strongest fabric. I'm only sorry it came to this. As she stepped into the afternoon light, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a pattern complete. The fire had revealed Crosby's desperation, and her gentle prodding had brought the truth to light. But there was work still to be done. Clara's testimony to confirm Eliza's alibi, and a final check on Vance's card game. The tapestry was nearly finished, and Miss Marple, with her unerring eye, would ensure every stitch was secure. Chapter 11. The village reflects. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and gold. As Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting resumed in her lap. The confession of Gerald Crosby, extracted in the stark light of the police station, had unraveled the mystery of Amos Finch's death, yet it brought no joy to her heart. The fire, set to erase a landlord's debts, had consumed a life, leaving a tear in the fabric of the village that would not easily mend. Her notebook, now closed on the table, held the final stitches of the case. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the human frailties it had exposed. The village, too, was grappling with the truth. By midday, word of Crosby's arrest had spread, carried on the swift wings of gossip from the bakery to the post office. Mrs. Bantry, ever the hub of such news, telephoned Miss Marple as she prepared her afternoon tea, her voice a mix of triumph and dismay. "Jane, you've done it again," she exclaimed. "Crosby, of all people. I knew he was slippery, but to set that fire, poor Mr. Finch. How did you know?" Miss Marple, stirring her tea, smiled faintly. "Oh, Dolly, I only listened and watched. People reveal themselves, you know, in the little things, nervous glances, hasty words. Mr. Crosby's charm was a thin veil, and his debts were too heavy to hide. But to kill a man," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice rising, "all for money. It's dreadful, Jane. What happens now?" "The law will take its course," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "And the village will heal, as it always does, though I dare say we'll all look at our neighbors a bit differently for a while." As she hung up, Miss Marple reflected on the suspects who had been cleared. Tom Reed, the ambitious apprentice, had been shaken by suspicion but was now free to pursue his dreams. She had heard from Mr. Tuttle that Tom had secured a loan from a kindly shopkeeper in Much Benham, enough to start a small tailoring business of his own. His sketches, once dismissed by Finch, would soon adorn new suits, and the village, ever supportive of its own, had begun sending him work. Miss Marple smiled at the thought. A young man's talent, once a motive for suspicion, now a source of hope. Eliza Finch, too, had found a path forward. Miss Marple's visit to Clara in Much Benham, though no longer necessary to test an alibi, had confirmed Eliza's story. She had indeed been with her sister the night of the fire, though Clara's vagueness stemmed from a late-night argument that had left her distracted. Eliza, freed from the shadow of suspicion, was packing to join Clara permanently, seeking a fresh start away from the memories of a loveless marriage. Miss Marple, who had seen her at the station that morning, noted a softness in her eyes, as if grief had finally replaced resentment. Harold Vance, the pompous client, had been chastened by the ordeal. Inspector Craddock's inquiries revealed his card game alibi was shaky. Dr. Haydock and Mr. Lumley admitted they'd left the Red Lion earlier than claimed, too deep in their cups to notice Vance's absence. Yet with Crosby's confession, Vance's prideful dispute over a bill became a mere footnote. Miss Marple learned he had quietly paid Tom Reed to repair the disputed jacket, a gesture that spoke of embarrassment more than guilt. Pride, she mused, could wound as deeply as greed, but it rarely burned as fiercely. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and walked to her garden, where the last roses of summer clung to their stems. The village was quiet now, the smoke of the fire a fading memory, but its lessons lingered. Miss Marple thought of Amos Finch, his life stitched into the fabric of St. Mary Mead, now reduced to a photograph on Eliza's mantel. She thought of Crosby, whose desperation had unraveled into tragedy, and of the others, each touched by the fire's shadow. Human nature, she knew, was a tapestry of flaws and virtues, its patterns predictable yet ever surprising. As she clipped a wilted rose, Miss Marple recalled a similar case in a neighboring village, where a fire had hidden a theft, only to reveal the thief's guilt through a careless word. Crosby's mistake had been his receipt, left in the ashes, and his agitation at the rumor of a witness. Such small threads, she reflected, could undo the grandest schemes. The village, like her garden, would recover, its roots deep and resilient. But it would carry the scar of this tragedy, a reminder of the cost of hidden motives. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple lit a small fire in the grate, its warmth a contrast to the chill of her thoughts. She opened her notebook one last time, adding a final note: case resolved, greed the spark, truth the needle. The fire had exposed the frailties of St. Mary Mead, but it had also revealed its strength, the quiet vigilance of neighbors, the persistence of truth. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her heart heavy but her mind at peace. The pattern was complete, and the village, like her knitting, would go on, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 12. A quiet resolution spring had crept into St. Mary Mead, softening the village with bursts of primroses and the tender green of new leaves. The scars of the winter's tragedy, the fire that had claimed Amos Finch's shop and life, were fading, though not forgotten. Miss Jane Marple sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room at Gossington Hall, a cup of tea balanced on her knee, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as the village clock. The air was warm with the scent of freshly baked scones, and Mrs. Bantry, her scarf a vivid splash of crimson, leaned forward with the eagerness of a child awaiting a story. "Jane, you must tell me everything," Mrs. Bantry insisted, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Gerald Crosby, of all people. I knew he was charming to a fault, but to set that fire, how did you piece it together? And what's become of the others? I've been positively bursting to know." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as serene as the spring light filtering through the lace curtains. "Oh, Dolly, it was no great feat. People are much the same, you know, whether in St. Mary Mead or anywhere else. They weave their own patterns, and when you watch closely, the flaws show through. Mr. Crosby's greed was a loose thread, and it only needed a gentle tug to unravel." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, scattering crumbs from her scone. "But how did you know to tug at him? There was Tom Reed, looking so shifty, and Eliza Finch, with her sour face, and that dreadful Mr. Vance. always blustering about his bills. Any of them could have done it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her needles pausing. They could have Dolly, but they didn't. Tom was ambitious, yes, and perhaps not entirely truthful about his movements that night. But his heart was in his work, not in malice. I visited his new shop in Much Benham last week. Such fine suits he's making, with those bold designs he sketched. The village is proud of him, you know, and Mrs. Price has already ordered a jacket. Mrs. Bantry nodded, her scarf slipping slightly. And Eliza, I heard she's gone to live with her sister. Good riddance, if you ask me. She was never happy here. Unhappiness can make people seem guilty when they're not, Miss Marple said gently. Eliza's marriage was a heavy burden, and her bitterness was plain. But Clara confirmed she was in Much Benham that night, though their little spat made her memory hazy. Eliza's free now, in a way, to start anew. I saw her at the station, and there was a lightness in her step, as if she'd laid down a weight. And Vance, Mrs. Bantry pressed, leaning closer. He was such a pompous sort. I half expected him to be the one, with that row over his bill. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Mr. Vance's pride was his loudest feature, but it wasn't deadly. His alibi was shaky. Dr. Haydock and Mr. Lumley were too deep in their ale to be sure of the time, but Crosby's confession cleared him. He's quieter now, I hear, and paid Tom promptly for mending that jacket. Sometimes a scare can mend a man's ways, if only a little. Mrs. Bantry sighed, reaching for another scone. But Crosby, how did you know it was him? That receipt you found, and the bottle fragment, was that enough? Not alone, Miss Marple admitted, her needles resuming their dance. It was the pattern, Dolly, his debts, the insurance inquiry, his presence near the shop. Each was a stitch. When Tom admitted seeing him with a bottle, and the rumor of a witness made him falter, it was clear he was fraying. His confession, though, was the final thread. He thought the shop was empty, you see, and the insurance would save him. But greed, like a poorly cut seam, always comes undone. Mrs. Bantry shook her head, her voice softening. Poor Mr. Finch, to think he was working late, alone, when that fire started. It's a sad end for such a quiet man. Sad indeed. Miss Marple agreed, her gaze drifting to the window, where a blackbird hopped across the lawn. But St. Mary Mead has a way of healing. The shop's ruins are being cleared, and I hear a new bakery may take its place. Life goes on, as it must. Mrs. Bantry leaned back, her scarf now thoroughly askew. You're a marvel, Jane. The way you see things, little glances, odd words. I'd have suspected everyone and no one, and got nowhere. What's next for you? Another mystery, I suppose. Miss Marple chuckled, a soft, musical sound. I hope not, Dolly. I'm quite content with my knitting and my garden. But the village has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? People are never quite what they seem, and secrets have a habit of surfacing. As she spoke, her eyes caught a flicker of movement outside, a neighbor hurrying past, her face anxious. Miss Marple's smile remained, but her mind stirred. St. Mary Mead was quiet now, its tapestry mended, but she knew another puzzle would soon emerge, another thread to pull. She set her tea down and picked up her needles, their steady rhythm a promise that, whatever came, she would be ready to weave the truth from the village's intricate patterns.